She was down to her last $20 when the most dangerous man in Chicago slid into her diner booth. He didn't want her life, and he didn't want her body. He slid a briefcase across the table. Pretend to be my wife for 14 days, or we both die. Stella Hayes was intimately familiar with the exact weight of desperation. It sat on her chest like a concrete block, making every breath a conscious effort. At 26, her life was a series of past due notices and exhausted sighs. Her younger sister, Sarah, was in the ICU at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, fighting a rare autoimmune disease. The insurance had capped out weeks ago. If Stella didn't wire $80,000 by the end of the month, the hospital would be legally forced to transfer Sarah to a state facility, a move the doctors privately admitted would likely kill her. So Stella worked. She did freelance graphic design by day, waited tables at a diner by night, and picked up high-end catering gigs on the weekends. It was during one of these catering gigs at a gala on Michigan Avenue 3 nights ago that her life collided with a speeding train named Lucien Rossi. She had been carrying a tray of champagne flutes out the service entrance in the pouring rain when her worn-out heels snapped. She braced for the shattered glass and the inevitable firing, but instead, a firm hand gripped her waist, pulling her flush against a bespoke wool suit. She had looked up into eyes the color of forged steel. For a split second, they just stared at each other. Then, a blinding sequence of camera flashes erupted from the street corner. The man had cursed in rapid Italian, shielded her face with his overcoat, and vanished into a waiting black Lincoln Navigator. Stella hadn't thought much of it, beyond the relief of not paying for broken crystal, until today. The diner was empty, the neon sign buzzing a monotonous hum against the rainy Tuesday afternoon window. Stella was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door jingled. He didn't look like a mobster from the movies. There were no flashy rings, no fedoras. Lucien Rossi looked like a ruthless Wall Street CEO. He wore a charcoal Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than Stella's annual rent. He was followed by 2 men who moved with the silent, heavy grace of apex predators. Lucien gestured for them to wait by the door, walked over to the corner booth, and sat down. "Stella Hayes," he said. His voice was a low baritone that commanded the room without raising a decibel. Stella froze, the damp rag trembling in her hand. "Do I know you?" 3 nights ago, the alley behind the Drake Hotel. Lucien didn't blink. "Sit down, Stella." Every instinct screamed at her to run to the kitchen and call the police, but her legs moved on their own volition. She slid into the vinyl booth opposite him. "My name is Lucien Rossi," he said, steepling his fingers. "I am the head of the Rossi family. You might know us from the construction and shipping empires in this city. The FBI knows us for other things. I am not here to hurt you. In fact, I am here to solve both of our problems." Stella swallowed hard. "I don't have any problems with you." "No, but you have an $80,000 problem at Northwestern Memorial." The color drained from her face. "How do you know about Sarah?" "I know everything about you," Lucien said smoothly. "I know you maxed out 3 credit cards. I know your landlord, David Miller, is threatening eviction. And I know you are a woman who will do absolutely anything to keep her sister breathing." He reached into his jacket, pulled out a sleek leather folder, and laid it between them. 3 days ago, when those paparazzi took our photo, it ended up on the desk of a very specific gossip columnist. But worse, it ended up on the desk of my father, Don Emilio Rossi. Lucien's jaw tightened. "My father is dying of lung cancer. He has days, maybe 2 weeks left. He controls the legal trusts, the offshore accounts, the legitimate fronts of our entire syndicate, and, he is a deeply traditional, paranoid man." Stella stared at him, bewildered. "What does this have to do with me?" "My father believes my younger brother Leo is too reckless to run the family, but he believes I am too detached, too ruthless, and unanchored. He refuses to sign the transfer of power to me unless I prove I have a foundation, a wife." Lucien leaned forward, the faint scent of cedar and expensive cologne invading her senses. "When he saw that photo, me holding a civilian woman in the rain, he demanded to meet her. He thinks I've been hiding a fiancé." "Tell him the truth," Stella whispered. Lucien offered a bleak, humorless smile. "If I tell him the truth, he signs the empire over to my uncle, Carmine. Carmine is a butcher. If he takes power, a bloody turf war will tear Chicago apart. My men will die. Innocent people will die. Carmine will undoubtedly have me killed, and because you were photographed with me, he will likely kill you too, just to tie up loose ends." Stella's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "You're crazy. This is a joke." "I assure you, Stella, the men standing at the door don't do jokes. Lucien opened the folder. Inside was a cashier's check from Chase Bank. This is a legally binding non-disclosure agreement and a temporary marriage certificate, already notarized by a corrupt judge on my payroll. Pretend to be my wife, move into my penthouse, smile for my father, convince him we are in love, and hold my hand at his funeral. For how long? 2 weeks. 14 days. Once the ink dries on his will and I secure the legal transition of the family assets, we quietly annul the marriage. You walk away. And in return? Stella asked, her voice shaking. Lucien slid the cashier's check across the table. Stella looked down. $2 million. Your sister's hospital bills are paid in full by 8 a.m. tomorrow, Lucien said softly. She gets bumped to the top of the list for the experimental stem cell trial in Boston. You walk away from this diner forever. You get your life back. Stella stared at the zeros. It was blood money. It was dangerous, insane, and completely illegal. But as she looked at the check, she didn't see a mob boss or a cartel war. She saw Sarah, pale and fragile, smiling in a hospital bed. She saw the crushing weight of debt vanishing into thin air. "What are the rules?" she asked, her voice suddenly steady. A flicker of genuine surprise crossed Lucien's stoic features before his mask slipped back into place. "You do exactly as I say. You ask no questions about my business. You do not leave my side, and you convince everyone in my family that I am the love of your life. Can you do that?" Stella picked up the heavy Mont Blanc pen resting beside the folder. "For $2 million, Mr. Rossi, I'll be whoever you want me to be." She signed her name. The ink was barely dry before Lucien stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Good. Pack a small bag. Your old life ends right now." The Rossi penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a glass and steel high-rise overlooking Lake Michigan. When the private elevator doors chimed open, Stella stepped into a world of obscene wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Chicago skyline, while dark mahogany, imported marble, and muted modern art screamed of a refined, quiet power. "Dante," Lucien called out as he tossed his keys onto a silver tray. One of the men from the diner stepped forward. He was built like a heavyweight boxer, with a jagged scar running through his left eyebrow. "Boss. Get Stella's old apartment cleared out, move her essentials here, destroy the rest. Put a 2-4-hour detail on her sister at the hospital. Nobody gets on that floor without my approval." Lucien turned to Stella. "Dante is my shadow. If I am not with you, he is. You don't take a breath without him knowing." Stella nodded silently, clutching her cheap canvas duffel bag. She felt entirely out of place, a street cat dropped into a tiger's cage. "The stylist team is waiting in the guest wing," Lucien continued, checking his Rolex. "You have 3 hours. Tonight we dine with my Uncle Carmine and my father's inner circle. They will test you. They will try to find the cracks." The next 3 hours were a blur of aggressive pampering. A team of tight-lipped women descended upon Stella. They stripped away her exhausted diner waitress aura, scrubbing, waxing, and polishing her until she didn't recognize her own reflection. They dressed her in a blood-red Alexander McQueen gown that hugged her curves and left her shoulders bare, pairing it with a diamond tennis bracelet that felt heavy with consequence. Her auburn hair was styled into elegant, cascading waves. When Stella finally walked out into the main living area, Lucien was pouring a scotch at the bar. He paused, the crystal decanter hovering over the glass. His eyes swept over her, an unreadable expression flashing in his dark gaze. For a second, the cold Mafia boss seemed to vanish, replaced by a man genuinely struck by what he saw. "Will I do?" Stella asked, fighting the urge to fidget with the expensive silk. "You look." Lucien cleared his throat, setting the bottle down. "You look like a Rossi. Remember, Stella, confidence. Do not look away first." The dinner took place in a private, soundproof room at Il Sogno, a Michelin-starred restaurant Lucien owned. The moment Stella walked in with her arm looped through Lucien's, the atmosphere turned electric with tension. There were 12 men at the table, all impeccably dressed, all carrying an aura of quiet violence. Sitting at the head of the table was Uncle Carmine. He was an older man with silver hair pulled back, wearing a pinstripe suit. He smiled, but his eyes were entirely dead. "Lucien," Carmine rasped, standing up and opening his arms. "And the mysterious bride. I must admit, when I heard my nephew eloped with a commoner, I thought he had finally lost his mind." "Uncle Carmine," Lucien said, his tone perfectly even. "This is Stella." "Stella." Carmine took her hand, his skin dry and cold like parchment. He kissed her knuckles, his gaze lingering on her face. "A beautiful girl. But tell me, my dear, how does a girl from the South Side end up marrying the most dangerous bachelor in the Midwest? It all seems a bit, sudden." The entire table went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. They were waiting for her to stumble. Stella felt Lucien's hand tighten imperceptibly on her waist. He was nervous. The realization hit her like a physical blow. His life depends on me right now. Stella tilted her chin up, locking eyes with Carmine. She forced a soft, confident laugh. Sudden? Perhaps to you, Carmine. But Lucien and I have known each other for quite some time. We just preferred to keep our private life away from prying eyes. She turned to Lucien, reaching up to gently trace the lapel of his suit. It was a bold, intimate gesture. She looked into his eyes, forcing every ounce of desperate emotion into her gaze. When you love a man who carries the weight of the world, you don't care about a big wedding. You just care about him coming home safe. A few of the older men at the table murmured in approval. The tension broke slightly. Lucien looked down at her, a genuine spark of admiration in his eyes. He leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her temple. My beautiful wife, he murmured, loud enough for the table to hear. Carmine's smile didn't reach his eyes. How romantic. Well, let us eat. We have much to discuss. Specifically, the shipments coming through the port next Thursday. As the dinner progressed, Stella sat quietly, playing the part of the devoted, adoring wife. But she listened. She noticed the way Carmine constantly prodded Lucien, looking for weakness. And she noticed the subtle shift in Lucien's demeanor when the Thursday shipment was mentioned. Later that night, back at the penthouse, the facade finally dropped. They were in the master bedroom. Lucien had insisted she sleep there to maintain the illusion for the household staff. Stella sat on the edge of the massive king-size bed, rubbing her temples, while Lucien poured himself another drink. You did well tonight, Lucien said, his back to her. Carmine bought it, for now. What happens next Thursday, Lucien? Stella asked quietly. Lucien froze. He turned around, his expression hardening. I told you, you don't ask about the business. I'm not an idiot. Stella shot back, standing up. Carmine was practically gloating. The way your men shifted in their seats when he mentioned the port, and the way you said your father only has 2 weeks left, Thursday is exactly 2 weeks from today. Lucien stared at her, the silence stretching until it was suffocating. He walked over, closing the distance between them until he was looking down at her, his presence overwhelming. You want the truth, Lucien whispered, his voice laced with a dangerous edge. My father isn't just dying. He's stepping down right before the largest weapons import this family has ever orchestrated. Carmine isn't just trying to take over the family, he's working with an FBI informant. He plans to tip off the feds next Thursday, have me arrested for the shipment, and seize control while I rot in federal prison. Stella stepped back, her breath hitching. Then why the marriage? Why me? Lucien's eyes softened just a fraction, a flash of vulnerability breaking through the ice. Because federal judges don't sign wiretaps or raid warrants on high-profile society newlyweds without rock-solid proof. It's a PR nightmare. They backed off the moment our marriage certificate was filed. You aren't just an alibi for my father, Stella. He reached out, his thumb gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The touch sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. You are my human shield, he confessed softly. And if Carmine finds out this marriage is a sham before Thursday, he will kill you just to get to me. Stella stared at the man she had bound herself to. The $2 million suddenly felt very, very cheap. She wasn't just playing a wife. She was playing a pawn in a deadly game of chess, and the board was already covered in blood. The following week was a masterclass in psychological warfare. To the outside world, Stella and Lucien were a whirlwind romance, splashed across the society pages of the Chicago Tribune. Inside the penthouse, they were two soldiers navigating a minefield. But the hardest part for Stella wasn't pretending to love a mafia boss. It was realizing how terrifyingly easy it was becoming. On Tuesday morning, Lucien surprised her. Instead of his usual departure for the syndicate's headquarters, he ordered Dante to bring the armored SUV to the front. We are going to Northwestern Memorial, Lucien announced, adjusting his silk tie in the foyer mirror. You need to see your sister, and I need to be seen supporting my grieving wife. Stella's heart leapt, but she quickly masked it with a nod. The ride to the hospital was silent, but the moment they stepped onto the ICU floor, Lucien's hand slid to the small of her back. The warmth of his palm bled through her cashmere sweater, an anchor in the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway. When they reached Sarah's room, Stella froze. The cramped, shared ward she was used to was gone. Sarah had been moved to the corner VIP suite. There were fresh lilies by the window, state-of-the-art monitoring equipment, and a private round-the-clock nurse. Sarah, pale but smiling brightly, sat up against the pillows. Stella and you must be the famous Lucien. Lucien stepped forward. The ruthless, cold-blooded Don vanished. He smiled a genuine, warm smile that transformed his sharp features and gently took Sarah's frail hand. It is an honor, Sarah. Stella has told me so much about your strength. Stella watched, entirely captivated, as Lucien spent the next 20 minutes asking Sarah about her favorite books and her dream of visiting the Amalfi Coast. He wasn't performing for the cameras or for his men. There was a quiet, profound empathy in his eyes. When they stepped back into the hallway, Stella grabbed his sleeve. You didn't have to do all of this. The VIP suite, the private nurse. That wasn't in the contract. Lucien looked down at her, his expression softening. I told you I would take care of your problem, Stella. I don't do things halfway. He reached out, gently wiping away a tear that had escaped her eye. No one hurts what is mine. The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded with an implication that made Stella's breath catch. What is mine? But the illusion of safety shattered the very next night. It was the weekly Rossi family Sunday dinner, a mandatory gathering held at Don Emilio's sprawling estate in Lake Forest. The mansion was a fortress, crawling with armed guards. Stella sat quietly at the massive dining table, nursing a glass of Barolo, while the men argued over union contracts and shipping routes. Lucien was called away to take a secure phone call in the Don's study. Stella took the opportunity to step out onto the terrace to get some fresh air. The night was thick with humidity, the crickets chirping loudly in the manicured gardens. Enjoying the view, Stella? Stella whipped around. Uncle Carmine stepped out from the shadows of the stone pillars, pulling a silver cigar case from his breast pocket. He was completely alone. It's beautiful, Stella said, keeping her voice steady, though her pulse drummed frantically in her ears. Carmine stepped closer, clipping the end of his cigar. You know, I ran a background check on you. A waitress. A girl drowning in debt. And suddenly, my nephew, a man who has never shown an ounce of sentimentality in his 32 years, sweeps you off your feet. Love is unpredictable, Carmine. Carmine laughed, a dry, rattling sound. He lit the cigar, the red ember illuminating his hollowed cheeks. I don't believe in love. I believe in leverage. And Lucien is hiding something. I can smell it. He leaned in, the stench of tobacco and stale wine washing over her. If I find out you are playing a game with this family, Stella, I won't just kill you. I will pay a visit to that fancy VIP room at Northwestern Memorial. I hear your sister is very fragile. Pure ice injected straight into Stella's veins. Her vision swam with rage and terror. Before she could speak, the terrace doors swung open. Lucien stood there, his silhouette dark and imposing against the warm light of the dining room. His eyes darted from Stella's pale face to Carmine's smug grin. The temperature on the terrace seemed to drop 10 degrees. Is there a problem here, Uncle? Lucien's voice was dangerously low. Not at all, nephew, Carmine said, stepping back and raising his hands in mock surrender. Just getting to know the bride. He slipped past Lucien and back into the house. Lucien was at her side in an instant, his hands gripping her shoulders. What did he say to you? Did he touch you? He threatened Sarah, Stella whispered, her voice trembling. He knows, Lucien. He knows something is wrong. Lucien swore viciously in Italian. Look at me, he commanded, tilting her chin up so her eyes met his. Carmine is a dying dog, backed into a corner. Thursday is 3 days away. After that, he is finished. You just have to hold on. Make him believe it, Stella said desperately. Right now, he's watching us from the glass. Lucien blinked, momentarily confused. What? Kiss me. Make him believe I am yours. Stella didn't wait for his permission. She grabbed the lapels of his suit and pulled him down to her. It was supposed to be a performance, a desperate act of survival. But the moment Lucien's lips crashed against hers, the world tilted on its axis. He didn't hesitate. His arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, lifting her slightly off the ground. The kiss was punishing, desperate, and entirely intoxicating. It tasted like scotch, danger, and a raw, suppressed hunger. Stella's fingers tangled in his dark hair, entirely losing herself in the sensation. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing heavily, staring at each other with wide, shocked eyes. The line hadn't just been blurred. It had been obliterated By Wednesday afternoon, the tension in the penthouse was suffocating. Tomorrow was Thursday, the day of the shipment, the day of Carmine's supposed coup, and the day Don Emilio was scheduled to sign the final transition documents. Lucien had been gone since dawn, locking down the ports and preparing for a war he hoped to win legally before a single bullet could be fired. Stella was pacing the living room when the private elevator chimed. It wasn't Lucien. It was Dante, looking uncharacteristically grim. "Get your coat, ma'am," Dante said, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. "The Don wants to see you." Stella froze. "Lucien told me to stay here." "The Don overrules Lucien," Dante said flatly, "and you don't keep a dying king waiting." 30 minutes later, Stella was escorted into the master bedroom of the Lake Forest estate. The room smelled of antiseptic and old paper. Don Emilio Rossi lay in a massive 4-poster bed, hooked up to an IV and an oxygen tank. He looked like a ghost of the terrifying man he once was, but his dark eyes, exact replicas of Lucien's, were still sharp as obsidian. "Leave us," Emilio rasped, waving a trembling, spotted hand at his guards. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving Stella alone with the head of the Mafia. "Come closer!" "Go," he croaked. Stella stepped forward, her hands folded tightly in front of her. "Don Emilio, how are you feeling?" He let out a wet, rattling cough that sounded like a death knell. "I am dying, Stella. Save the pleasantries." He adjusted himself on the pillows, his piercing gaze locking onto her. "I know the marriage is fake." The floor seemed to drop out from beneath her. Stella couldn't breathe. I don't. "Do not insult my intelligence," Emilio interrupted. "Lucien thinks he is clever. He thinks filing a fraudulent marriage certificate with a judge I appointed 30 years ago would escape my notice. He thinks I don't know about Carmine's little alliance with the FBI. Stella stared at him, horrified. "If you know, why did you let it happen? Why didn't you stop it?" Emilio smiled, a chilling expression that sent shivers down her spine. "Because I needed to see if my son had the ruthless ingenuity to outsmart his uncle. And he did. He brought in a civilian shield. A brilliant, tactical move to paralyze the feds. But what fascinated me, Stella, was who he chose to be his shield." The Don reached over to his bedside table and picked up a manila folder, tossing it onto the foot of the bed. "Open it." With trembling hands, Stella picked up the folder and flipped it open. Inside was a black and white photograph of a man she hadn't seen in 10 years. "Dad?" she whispered, a tear escaping her eye. Michael Hayes had been an accountant. He had died in a hit and run when Stella was 16, leaving her to raise Sarah alone. "Your father," Emilio said quietly, "was one of the best bookkeepers in Chicago. He was also skimming off the top of Carmine's operation for years. Carmine found out. He ordered the hit that killed your father." Stella stumbled back, clutching the folder to her chest, her mind short-circuiting. Carmine killed her dad. "But Michael was smart," Emilio continued, his breathing labored. "Before he died, he hid a ledger that details every single politician, judge, and police commissioner Carmine has bribed. It is the only thing that can destroy Carmine completely. Carmine has spent the last 10 years looking for it. A month ago, his men finally tracked down Michael's surviving daughters, you and Sarah." The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in Stella's mind. The random paparazzi photo, the $2 million. Lucien knew. Stella breathed, tears spilling over her cheeks. "Lucien has had his men watching you for 5 years, Emilio corrected. "My son is a hardened killer, but he has a fatal flaw. He carries guilt for the sins of this family. When he realized Carmine was moving in to torture you and your sister for the ledger, Lucien didn't just hire you for a fake marriage, Stella. He married you to invoke the highest law of La Cosa Nostra." Stella looked up, her heart shattering. "What law?" "The blood vow," Emilio whispered. "The wife of a Don is untouchable. By claiming you as his bride, Lucien essentially put a loaded gun to the head of the entire syndicate. If Carmine touches you, the commission will skin Carmine alive. Lucien didn't drag you into the Mafia to save himself, Stella. He dragged you into the Mafia to save you." The room spun. Lucien hadn't used her. He had risked his entire empire, his relationship with his father, and his own life to throw a bulletproof vest over a woman he had been secretly watching over for years. "Why are you telling me this?" Stella asked, wiping her eyes fiercely. "Because," Emilio said, sinking back into the pillows, his energy fading rapidly, "Carmine has realized he cannot win legally tomorrow. So, he is not going to wait for tomorrow. He is moving on the penthouse tonight. And my son, for all his tactical brilliance, is blinded by his feelings for you. He will die trying to protect you unless you help him." Stella didn't wait to be dismissed. She ran out of the room, sprinting past the guards and down the grand staircase. "Dante!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the marble walls. "Get the car! Now!" They tore back to the city, Dante pushing the SUV to 100 miles an hour. Stella's phone was pressed to her ear, but Lucien's line went straight to voicemail. When they skidded to a halt in the underground garage of the high-rise, the air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and gunpowder. The fire alarms were screaming. Dante drew his weapon, pushing Stella behind his massive frame. "Stay behind me. If anything happens, you run to the street." They took the emergency stairs, the heavy metal doors echoing with the sounds of distant gunfire. When they reached the penthouse floor, the beautiful mahogany doors were blown off their hinges. Stella stepped into the ruin of her temporary home. The modern art was shredded by bullets. The floor-to-ceiling windows were shattered, letting in the howling Chicago wind. And there, in the center of the living room, bleeding from a gunshot wound to his left shoulder, was Lucien. He was standing over two of Carmine's men, his gun raised. He turned at the sound of her footsteps. His steel eyes widened in sheer panic. "Stella," he choked out, dropping his weapon and stumbling toward her. "I told you to stay away." She didn't care about the blood. She didn't care about the danger. Stella ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck, holding him as if her sheer willpower could keep him alive. "I know," she sobbed into his chest. "I know everything. I know about my dad. I know what you did." Lucien stiffened, his good arm wrapping fiercely around her waist. He buried his face in her hair. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I couldn't let him hurt you. I couldn't." Before Stella could reply, the sound of a slow, rhythmic clapping echoed from the hallway. Uncle Carmine stepped over the rubble, an assault rifle casually resting against his hip. He was flanked by 6 heavily armed mercenaries. "Well, well, well," Carmine smiled, his dead eyes gleaming with triumph. "How tragically romantic, but I'm afraid the honeymoon is over." The wind howled through the shattered windows of the penthouse, carrying the bitter chill of Lake Michigan, but Stella only felt the heat radiating from Lucien's chest. He pushed her gently but firmly behind him, shielding her with his body despite the blood soaking through his ruined Tom Ford suit. "You always were too sentimental, Lucien," Carmine sneered, stepping over the debris. The 6 mercenaries fanned out, their assault rifles leveled squarely at Lucien and Dante. "Your father built an empire on blood and fear. You? You risked it all for a ghost's daughter." "Michael Hayes wasn't a ghost, Carmine. He was a good man you murdered to cover your own theft," Lucien said, his voice terrifyingly calm despite his injury. Carmine barked a harsh laugh. "Michael was a thief who stole my property, the ledger. I've spent 10 years tearing this city apart looking for it. When I found out his pathetic daughters were still in Chicago, I knew it was only a matter of time before I squeezed the location out of them. But you had to play the hero." Stella gripped the back of Lucien's jacket, her knuckles white. "Where is the ledger, Lucien?" she whispered frantically. "If he wants it, give it to him." Carmine smiled, a sickening display of yellowed teeth. "Listen to your fake wife, nephew. Hand over the ledger, sign the transition documents, transferring the family assets to me right now, and I'll make sure your deaths are quick. Refuse, and I'll have my men visit the VIP ward at Northwestern Memorial tonight." Lucien didn't flinch. He didn't reach for his discarded weapon. Instead, a slow, dark smile spread across his pale face. It was the smile of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. "You're right about one thing, Uncle," Lucien said, his voice echoing in the ruined room. "I did know who Stella was. I've had my men watching her for 5 years, making sure you never got close. But you're wrong about the ledger." Carmine narrowed his eyes, his grip tightening on his rifle. "What are you talking about?" "Michael Hayes was a genius," Lucien continued smoothly. "He didn't bury the ledger in a safe deposit box or hide it under floorboards. He digitized it. 10 years ago, he encrypted the files and hid them on a vintage USB drive inside a cheap plastic locket, a locket he gave to his 16-year-old daughter the day before you killed him." Stella gasped, her hand flying to her chest. The cheap gold-plated locket. She hadn't taken it off in a decade. It was the only thing she had left of her father. The stylists had tried to remove it on her first night in the penthouse, but Lucien had explicitly ordered them to let her keep it. "I cloned the drive the night you moved in, Stella," Lucien said softly, glancing back at her with an apologetic softness in his eyes. He turned back to Carmine, his expression hardening into granite. And as for your grand plan to seize the Thursday shipment and hand me over to your FBI handlers, that was a decoy. Carmine's face paled. You're bluffing. There is no shipment, Carmine. The boats are empty. The real delivery happened this morning at 8 a.m. when my lawyers walked into the Department of Justice with a decrypted copy of Michael's ledger. They handed over 10 years' worth of evidence detailing every bribe, murder, and extortion racket you've ever run. As if on cue, the deafening wail of police sirens pierced the night air. Red and blue lights began to reflect off the neighboring glass skyscrapers. The heavy thud of tactical boots echoed from the emergency stairwell. Carmine's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated panic. He raised his rifle, screaming in a blind rage. Kill them. Before his finger could completely depress the trigger, Dante moved with blinding speed. 2 suppressed shots rang out. Carmine's rifle dropped as a bullet shattered his right shoulder, sending him collapsing to the marble floor in agony. The mercenaries, realizing they had walked into a federal trap and their employer was ruined, instantly dropped their weapons and raised their hands just as heavily. Armed FBI SWAT teams breached the remaining doorways. Federal agents, drop your weapons, nobody move. Special Agent Harrison stepped through the smoke, his badge raised. He looked at the bleeding, groaning Carmine on the floor, then up at Lucien. Lucien Rossi, as per our immunity agreement, you and your wife are clear. Paramedics are waiting in the lobby. Lucien gave a curt nod before his legs finally gave out. Lucien! Stella screamed, catching him as he slumped to the floor. She pressed her hands frantically against his bleeding shoulder. We need a medic up here now. Lucien looked up at her, his breathing shallow. He reached up with his uninjured arm, his blood-stained fingers gently tracing her cheek. I told you, I would take care of your problem, Stella. You idiot, she sobbed, pressing her forehead against his. You almost died. You gave up your entire empire. The illegal half, Lucien whispered, a faint smile touching his lips. I kept the real estate and the shipping. I think I'm ready to be a legitimate businessman, if I have the right wife to keep me honest. 2 weeks later, the rain was gently tapping against the windows of Sarah's private hospital suite. Sarah was sitting up, laughing as Dante, who had surprisingly taken a liking to the younger sister, taught her how to play high-stakes poker with matchsticks. In the hallway, Stella stood by the coffee machine, watching them through the glass. She felt a warm, heavy presence step up behind her. Lucien, his left arm in a black sling, wrapped his right arm around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. My father passed away last night, Lucien murmured into her hair. Stella turned around, resting her hands on his chest. I'm so sorry, Lucien. He went peacefully. He knew the family was safe. Lucien reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of thick, notarized paper. Our 2 weeks are up. Carmine is in a federal supermax. The cartel ties are severed. You have the $2 million, and Sarah's surgery in Boston is scheduled for next month. He handed her the paper. It was the annulment. Stella looked down at the document. She thought about the waitress who had been drowning in debt just 14 days ago. She looked at the man standing in front of her, a man who had walked through fire, betrayed his own blood, and dismantled a criminal empire just to keep her safe. Slowly, deliberately, Stella tore the annulment papers in half. Then in quarters, she dropped the shredded pieces into the trash can beside them. I signed a contract, Mr. Rossi, Stella said, looking up into his steel eyes with a fierce, unwavering smile. And I don't break my promises. Lucien's eyes darkened with raw emotion. He leaned down, capturing her lips in a kiss that tasted of absolute certainty and a brand new beginning. In the end, the $2 million contract that began as a desperate plea for survival transformed into a lifelong vow. Stella didn't just save her sister, she broke the curse of a Mafia dynasty, pulling a ruthless king out of the darkness. Sometimes, the most beautiful love stories don't start with a fairy tale romance. They begin with a calculated risk, a loaded gun, and a terrifying leap of faith.